All right. It looks like we're just a couple seconds away. We'll give folks a minute or two to log on, and we're recording. And yeah. So let me welcome everyone to this installment of our new 8-part series, Leadership at Lunchtime, Leading in the New Normal. I'm Mike Grogine, the Director of the Executive MBA in Strategic Leadership. The process that we go through on this is going to be very similar to what we've done the last 2.5 months. We have an expert, a seasoned professional joining us. We're going to spend about 15 minutes talking about the topic of the day, and then we're going to open up the remainder of time to Q&A because, in honesty, that's probably the most valuable portion of all of this because it addresses exactly what you, the participants, want to know about. So our topic is in and around kind of transforming a leadership culture. And we're going to talk about, Brian's going to, remark on culture itself and then the leadership elements of it. And, but then you take us where you need to, where you want us to go. Let me introduce, a strong, friend of the program, an alumni, 2006, I think it is that right?
Yes.
2006. So a couple months ago, Brian graduated from our program. He has been an executive human resources professional for a very long time, doing work with Volvo, Cargill, Eaton Cooper, looking at Keystone Foods, and he's now working in, is it Potence or Potence?
Potence.
I have never asked you how to pronounce that. So Potence Partners, where he really kind of helps build leadership capacity and focusing on performance and outcomes. And so it is absolutely my delight to welcome Brian Bonomo today to kind of have a chat with us. So Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here. And I'll assume all the folks that are dialing in now must not have been here for the first time, because why would they want to hear my opinions twice?
I'm going to disagree with that quite strongly because let's be honest, just the watching of the recording after your last session, had a substantial amount of folks. It almost, tripled the amount of viewers we had during that day. So we're so delighted that you can join us again today.
My honor and privilege. My hope is that perhaps I share something that allows you to reflect and pick up an insight or two. If it's a little bit provocative, all the better. Not looking to be agreed with, just looking to kind of extend the dialogue. Really, I've already warned Erica and Mike, we want to make very liberal use of the Q&A and chat function, so please drive in. We won't make this stump the chump, as it were, but ask the questions that you wish you had someone in the senior part of your organization ask. But maybe wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable, because what the other participants will get from each of you collectively will be far greater than what Mike and I could contribute. So let's let it rip.
Absolutely. And so, the whole purpose of this is to create a moment of reflection in the midst of our busy leadership lives. And, we would be remiss if we did not realize that the last 9 days have been, in a word, astonishing compared in the history. I remember as a kid watching the TV with, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in honesty, I'm seeing the same level of passion and angst and activity. And so we are going to talk about leadership and culture. So I think it is appropriate for us to at least address some of those in the vein that what we're actually wanting to talk about here is how do we become better leaders? What can we do to own the space in front of us? And so, Brian, let me toss your first question your way. It's a bit of a softball. Why should we care about culture, and not societal culture, but kind of organizational culture?
Yeah. So, it's funny. It's a very deep and rich question. It's also very simple, and I'll reply with a simple response. It really boils down to culture influences your behavior. I don't think anyone would really argue with that. I think behavior absolutely influences performance results, both individual, team, and organization. I don't think many people would debate that. Ergo, I would say that culture clearly influences performance outcome. So, when you choose to ignore it, I'm not saying you will not otherwise meet certain success measures, but you're missing a vital lever in the overall contribution of your organization to either community or marketplace.
Yeah, and if we think about culture as the shared values and beliefs we have about what it means to be us, it is part of our collective identity, and absolutely our behaviors come from that identity. So if we have a strong belief in service orientation, if we have a strong belief in accountability, we will see service-oriented and accountable behaviors flow from it. And then we actually can hold each other accountable, can't we?
Yeah, at some point, I think that just kind of throws out my first question for folks to respond in chat. When you hear the word accountability, how does that land on you? Now, what's kind of your initial emotional response when you hear the word accountability?
Yeah. And interestingly, we've had conversations in a lot of the executive MBA realm on accountability. This goes back to, your old Army days, my old Army days. You're accountable to kind of three things. First of all, you're accountable to yourself. Are you consistent with your values, beliefs? Are you doing what you think is absolutely right to do? You're accountable to each other. So your teammates, the folks left and right of you, there's an accountability to doing the right thing and being predictable for them as well. And then we're accountable to our institutions. And in those institutions, we hope that they embody the principles that drive us and our teammates. And so that accountability actually has multiple points of destination. So let me dial down just a little bit more, and hopefully some folks will toss you questions about accountability.
Okay, great.
If we talk about a culture of leadership, what does that mean to you? So if we've got, we care about culture because behavior is important. What does a culture of leadership mean to you as a seasoned executive?
I think a culture of leadership promotes an atmosphere where every individual in the organization behaves like a board member or an owner. And really seizes the notion of being the chief executive officer of their space. It's looking at leadership as we and not as leadership as they. And when it's done well, even then it is still a work in process. And I know the last time I spoke with the group, I talked about the importance of the harmony of your personal and individual values and how they mesh with the organization's values. And we made the delineation between not the values on the poster or on the website, but the how stuff gets done in that organization. And to what degree is there resonance and harmony in that? Second is, do people feel like they can? I mean, or Nordstrom, Ritz-Carlton, folks that for essentially a generation now have been written about in leadership reviews and white papers about getting it right in terms of instilling kind of operational ownership for every employee in their role and treating them like they would expect an owner or a board member to do. Now, I'll be very candid. One of the challenges, I'm assuming many of the folks on this call are either in leadership roles, either they manage others, they may be in senior management roles, or they may have been in them in the past and feel like, well, I'm just, I'm a research scientist, not a department head anymore. What's my role as a leader? And I would say that we're entering a day and age where it's not the command and control hierarchy of leadership. The currency of good leadership now is influence. So when you have harmony between your values and the organization's, doesn't mean you have to have total agreement and they have to be a one-for-one parity, but there has to be a degree of harmony so that you can authentically be you, operating within the cultural construct of the organization that you serve. And so what does that mean? My goodness, what does it mean? Your employee experience is impacted, your employer brand. Now, I don't mean your brand to consumers. I mean, when you go out into the marketplace to cultivate talent, your culture is going to be reflected either accurately or unaccurately through a lot of sources that you don't. I mean, your PR person doesn't have control over. What do you want that story to be, and what is your role in that story? I really think a lot of it comes back to how do you as the individual show up? You're working for, I mean, I guess the first question is the organization that you serve worthy of your skills and talents? And then if so, even when you don't agree, you've kind of made a commitment. You know, a professional either meets that commitment, or when they realizes that that resonance has a disconnect and it's no longer in their heart, they make the tough choices. And that should be celebrated, by the way, not, you know, one of the things that always aggrieved me as a head of HR is when we did the perp walk for someone who gave a 60-day notice to take on a new challenge. And we make the person feel like a convicted felon on their last day. Someone literally shows up with boxes and watches them pack. Here's a person that's been a great contributor to your organization, unless, of course, they are facing felony charges or have done some for-cause behavior. What is our resistance to celebrating? It's almost like, well, you wanted off the team, you're a traitor, you're a loser, good luck, you're dead to me. Why do we do that? In the war for talent, alumni from organizations should be the #1 go-to recruiting pool after your internal folks and their immediate network, because they know you, they know your organization. Yet most leaders don't recognize that. We have very much an us and them mentality that they think is building a spree, and in actuality, it's just toxic.
You know, I love what you said at the first part, which is that everyone should, a leadership culture is all around us taking ownership and feeling like we own the piece of the organization that is ours. That almost trickles, I mean, that would trickle down to the contributors as well, because that's self-leadership at that point. And so they have to own the space in which they're contributing and influence those around them, maybe in informal ways, so that they can contribute better. And then the last thing you said is just, this has been something that I have chewed on for a while. This whole, once you leave us, your name is struck from the rolls and shall never be uttered again. That doesn't fit this world, because a lot of our folks are ambitious, and if they don't have a place in our organization, if we can't create the space for them, if we can cherish their departure, help them go to folks that we're partners with, help them go to, you know, a collaborative or you know, joint venture partners, they may come back to us much better than they went out. And so, you know, not just the goodwill, I think, of cherishing the, you know, their tenure and what they offer to us, we can actually create a space for them to come back at some time. And I think that's absolutely vital, particularly that war for talent. That's how we win. We get the right and best people in place.
There's so there are, for example, I'm not sure if we have any folks in the group representing Amazon. If so, I mean, this is totally neutral and certainly conscious strategic choice. Amazon has a very distinct flavor of performance-oriented culture. When they bring in new leaders from outside of the organization, there is an extremely rigorous vetting process and an extremely rigorous, you know, extended onboarding. When people don't work out, there are really good folks who at the end of that extended onboarding process either are opted out or choose to opt out. And some would look at that and say, why go through all that expense? Why go through all that effort? It's churn and burn. I'm not going to render a judgment on that. I will say this, in terms of an employer brand, there are you know, recent grads and recent MBAs that are clamoring to get their foot in the door at Amazon. Why? I mean, it's distribution, it's movement of goods, it's warehouse work where you skin your knuckles doing pick and pack and shipping. However, they have built an employer brand that they are a leadership training factory. If you have been through Amazon, if you've done an initial tour in leadership in Amazon and it doesn't work, it still has cachet. A generation or two, there was a textile company called Burlington Industries I'm going back to the 70s and 80s, but they were known throughout the country and the world for having one of the finest management training programs in the country, in any industry. And if you went through their program, you had an 80% success rate of getting to work for any employer you wanted simply because of that. So know that what does it do for your employer? If you're known as the proving ground for exceptional future leaders, it's kind of like a show horse. You didn't win the Derby. If you ran the Derby, don't you think you're going to be attractive in other venues? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's a lot of and it just, again, I think goes to the importance of fit. And I know I'm watching the time, and there's one key thing I know you were interested about. What's the how? Mm-hmm. How do you do this? And I just want to, and I'll open up to Q&A, but my response to that when you first asked the question was, I said, no way. How do you build and sustain a strategic culture of leadership? And I said, no way. But it's not N-O way, it's K-N-O-W way. And I would say it hinges on these things. And this is, oh, by the way, not something I read in a book. Actually, it's on a sticky note that I thought about for about 6 minutes before this call began. And I'd say the process begins with, number one, know yourself. Again, everything in your leadership journey comes back to being honest with yourself. What is your passion? What do you treasure? What is the impact you want to have? Knowing how to reasonably stretch yourself into areas of discomfort for the purpose of learning, but also knowing what is realistic and what are the restraints and constraints that you'll have to overcome, and being thoughtful about that. I think it's critically important to know your people. I did a lot of work in speaking, probably about 30 days ago, when the impact of the stay-at-home orders was really taking effect, and we were moving almost to virtual management. And I said, one of the keys is maintaining connection. If you're a supervisor who historically has liked there to be a bit of a buffer between my role as the supervisor and another's role as the team member, if you don't get in touch with the stress that person is carrying individually as a result of this, how can you possibly know when to breathe in encouragement and support and accountability? So know yourself, know your people. Number three, know your craft. Be technically competent, at least to the level of expectation for your role, +1%, +1 increment, +1 something, and be known as that. Expert, not necessarily, but at your craft, at the level of expectation, +1. Know yourself, know your people, know your craft, know whom you serve. Depending on your role, that could be out in the marketplace, it could be out in the community, it could be internal stakeholders, what some organizations will refer to as internal customers, external customer, consumer. Know who your organization serves, know who your team serves, but ultimately know who you serve. And if there's any question about how to define that, I offer you a simple one. Who does another count on, let me say this a different way. Who of the people in your circle, in your universe, in your work, of the stakeholders you have contact with, expect a product or service or delivery from you that anyone else that they got it from would be second best and slapped together? In other words, the organization wouldn't fall apart completely if you didn't do it, but the first person they go to with an expectation, that's who you serve. If you want to call that your primary customer, great. Your key stakeholder, great. But know whom you serve. And then finally, know that action is the most fluent language universally spoken in your organization. So know yourself, demonstrate in your behavior that people know that you are self-aware. Know your people. Let others see you demonstrate that you know your people. And if you can empathize and care, even better. Number three, know your craft. That's going to be one of the most visible things. Are you proficient in what you do and how you do it, or not? If you are not, and you are on a learning curve, do others around you know you're on a learning curve in a positive connotation of the word? They see you looking to close gaps that are keeping you from delivering the excellence you want to deliver. People will not hold a degree of ignorance against you if they see you looking to close the gap, just like you. When you see someone trying, does that not buy an element of grace? Fourth, know who you serve. and then finally is get out there and act it, behave it, be seen doing it. Simple formula, simple to describe, a little more challenging in action.
So I'm glad we're recording this because I'm going to go back and take notes later, because if I take notes now, I'll ignore my responsibility. So thank you for describing that. And I'm going to shamelessly steal it, but I will cite you. Hey, let's take some questions. And I think that's, really kind of the meat, the meat and potatoes of this. So Erica and Adam, it is on you to kind of toss the questions in.
Awesome. Hi, Brian. So my first question is, what can a leader do when they discover a counterculture in the organization?
Oh, wow. Great question, Erica. Thank you. I'll tell you, if people have a pad and pen available to them, I'm going to give you a little picture, and I'll kind of go through it quickly. If you'll do an x-axis and a y-axis, and say one is assertiveness, and have that the arrowhead actually pointing down, and across the x-axis going from left to right, we'll call that sensitivity. And I'm going to talk about 4 quadrants. I'm going to use word pictures of 4 animals. So in quadrant 1, the lower left-hand corner, just right in there, bull, as in bull in a china shop. In the box above it, so the upper left-hand quadrant, put sheep. In the lower right hand, put rhino. And in the upper right hand, put chameleon. Imperfect word pictures, but it's something a colleague shared with me. In fact, and if we'll give me a moment when we move to the next question, I want to make sure I properly cite her for giving me this. What she said is, most people in your organization are sheep. And now sheep, I don't mean that they're weak and they're dirty and they're smelly. It just means they're generally compliant. They get along, live along, get along, do their role, don't do much rabble rousing. They're either consciously or unconsciously supporting, enabling, if you will, the current culture in your organization. Bottom quadrant, that lower left-hand corner, is what I call the bull in the china shop, and you can only occupy that for the period of your onboarding. So we'll say about 90 to 100 days. That's new in an organization, new in a team, new in a site, new in a location, etc. And what that is a person who comes in with their own interpretation of behavioral expectations, and they're trying to figure out their way in this new cultural context for the organization. Over time, so we're going to slip over to now I'm in the lower right, and that's the rhino, and that's what I call the intentional disruptor. That's a person who knows that their fit is not great, and they feel like they may have a mandate to charge full speed ahead and get things done. And I want to stop there for a moment, because that's where most traditional strong leaders want to get to and want to stay. And in fact, pride themselves as being seen as a disruptor. And again, I think the most imperfect, animal picture that we've got is the chameleon, but what I'm intending to share there is it's someone who has to know how to influence the organization and not try to change everything at one time, who knows that evolution is a process that requires, you will be far more successful in moving something in an evolution by harnessing energy slowly and powerfully and moving it forward than trying to make all those changes through sheer force of will. And that's the lesson that the intentional disruptor, the rhino, just doesn't get. They try to do it with absolute conviction and passion and strength. And quite frankly, I'm sure all of us have worked for one. They believe they're going to be acknowledged as a hero in the organization, and sometimes they are. Many times they are individually revered, but 90+% of the time the organization is intolerant of them and they get spit out. or they feel like they're grinding themselves into a fine powder and they made a bad choice. You can call it diplomacy, you can call it politics, you can call it, I mean politics in the right frame. It's essentially knowing, how do I walk the talk? And, do I need to be right all the time? And what battles am I willing to pick? Because we all get, even if it's a righteous battle, you have to ask yourself, is this the one I'm willing to die for to have the impact that I want to have in the organization? So what do I do when I encounter resistance? I go back to my model that I told you just a moment ago. Number one, know myself. I'm encountering resistance. What is this resistance? What is the impact that it's having on me? What am I feeling about this resistance, and what's behind that feeling? Is it making me, is it a fear that I promised I'd have certain key deliverables in the first 100 days and this resistance is going to make me look like a failure? Is it I'm running into resistance and I'm afraid that if I committed to the organization that they were buying someone who knew how to solve these complex challenges, and if I have this resistance, I'm not going to be able to accomplish them and I'm going to look like a failure? Is it going to be, understand what it is about you. How are you responding to the resistance you're getting? And every story is a little different. Know your people. Why are they contributing to the resistance? What is behind their resistance? Are they afraid of that they don't have the right knowledge to be part of the new change? Are they afraid of losing influence in the organization or station or posture? Do they have a personal reason that this change is going to impact that has nothing to do with their work life, but might be so disruptive to their sense of identity or self that they feel it would be almost professionally suicidal to come alongside you as a leader in this change? The next one, know your craft. What are the tools that you know work when you've been in challenging change-related situations before? What have you tried that's not worked? Do a little personal post-mortem. What would you have done differently in those past situations that might be applicable here to help you see a path forward? And then again, understanding who you serve. Are the stakeholders that you're serving, do they actually kind of like the manner that the culture that currently exists supports how they get served? Help enlist allies that say, listen, what I'm doing, I'm not doing to you as a group that I'm trying to change. I'm doing this on behalf of the people next down the chain who are looking for more impact, better quality, faster resolution, greater degree of trust and confidence in the service we provide. Know what they're looking for and what the change you are looking to bring about. How does that affect more than just you and your one-up and your immediate team? Sorry, I don't mean I'm not saying it's the answer. When in doubt, it's a wonderful set of filters to try to go through. And I would highly recommend always starting with number one, understanding why this resistance is having an effect on you, name what that effect is, and then sit back and say, now that I know this, what have I learned?
Brian, I also think that why is absolutely so critical, because the basis of a counterculture means that it's running in opposition, or at least not parallel with the culture that we may want to have. And we can find some folks that maybe they're rhinos that the best intention, they think it's the way we should be driving in the institution. So, as opposed to, starting with the fact if someone is actually creating a micro culture that seems to be different, they're doing it out of disloyalty, or they're doing it out of treason. Maybe they believe that as they create that space, that is actually the appropriate way for folks to actually believe and act in. And I think getting to the why of that is easier than saying, okay, you guys are wrong, toe the line with us. So it's the ability to subsume people that are buying off on a different cultural spin is really difficult, and so we've got to be able to win them in. And
yeah, if I can throw something out, and again, I'm really concerned that although an attempt to make a concept a little easier to understand, the picture analogies are imperfect. at some point, if we'd ever want to come back and have a different conversation, Mike, I mean, I love to talk about kind of the heroic and post-heroic leader, because the paradigm of leadership has changed since I entered leadership in my early 20s, courtesy of Uncle Sam's family-owned business. And I will tell you, the paradigm of what leadership looked like in the 80s is not what the paradigm of leadership looks like today. It is different. And I think it requires an understanding of that, particularly because I suspect most of the folks on this call, either they're one-up or second-level manager, probably grew up in a leadership paradigm that more resembles what I encountered coming into the professional workforce in the 80s and 90s. That is not what people coming into the workforce post-2010 are experiencing. And if we have a chance, I'd love to kind of highlight for folks what's different, and more importantly, what is the impact both on our careers and our professional development and our leadership journey and the people that we serve and that we lead. Because it's remarkable and is only now starting to get conversation in the study of leadership arts. What else?
I've got a follow-up question as we talk about the different animals and everything, but it's a two-parter. So the first part of the question is, as we bring folks back into the offices, is it better to bring the rhinos in first to better manage them, or keep them out longer while developing a plan to manage their impact on our organization? And then determining what role they can play long-term, if any. So that's
Adam, could you please restate the first part of the question? Because I missed the first half. Thank you.
So as we bring folks back into the offices, is it better to bring the rhinos in first to better manage them, or keep them out longer while developing a plan to manage their impact on the organization, and then determining what role they can play long-term?
Wow, that's a great question. So I think I want to credit the person asking, because clearly they've pulled something out of this conversation and they're already thinking about action. And I applaud you for that. The second is, think about if these criteria, again, imperfectly defined as I did, if that is the key criteria that would be most effective for you to apply as you're looking for ramping back up in your, I'm going to say your office environment, knowing that might be office, it could be coming into the same geography, it could be a plant floor, it could look like anything. I really think if it were me, I would want to start with my core influencers more than I think that the passion for change, which is really what I think fuels the disruptors, is a great energy to have, but it can be very difficult to direct sometimes. So if I were a leader looking at my staff, my function, or my organization, and I had to stage how I was going to bring people back in the organization, number one, I would have a mission focus. What are the skills, competencies, and qualifications and capabilities that the people I serve most need back in-house quickly in order to effectively provide product or service? I think the second criteria I would use would be, who are my key influencers? Whether they're on board at this point or not, I would engage them and talk again about not necessarily returning to the way things were, but how do we use this return to create things the way we want them to be? That to me sounds like it might have greater impact than just trying to harness that nuclear fission of the passion around people who are, there's being unafraid to change the status quo. That's very admirable, but that can have a very short shelf life, if you will, if what they're constantly doing is bashing and thrashing and trying to change everything at once. You might find that it's a little harder to contain that energy, if you will. I hope that made some sense. I feel like I rambled a bit.
Yeah, but you've got me thinking about this fact that we talked about turning opportunity into crisis in a previous session. This is a good time to revisit or to re-envision what good looks like for the future. Because we have the opportunity, I think, of putting everything on the table and evaluating its appropriateness and fit for future purpose. And so it was the idea of transforming leadership culture is one of change. And so I think what you're talking about, Brian, is absolutely how do we leverage when folks come back, and how do you harness the energy and build the capacity. And I think it's a great answer that would lead us into a 5-hour discussion on organizational change and the sacred cows that we've never touched before that we may have to consider touching to actually be successful in the future. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eric and Adam, but you've got me intrigued. Let's have an offline conversation about some.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to.
Brian, okay, so my next question is, what role do organizational systems such as strategic human resources play in culture?
Let me tell you again. So this is coming with a big old ladle full of Brian bias. So I'm going to declare that on the front end. I once had the misguided assumption that my HR function was the custodian and guardian of all things culture, values, and talent. And I kind of wore that as a shield on my paladin armor as I strode around my organization in various places throughout the world. And then realized that determination was really misguided. And I think it played into some incredible organization dysfunction. A lot of HR functions derive a source of secondary power and perceived influence and authority by saying we're all about the people. And in my opinion, it's all about the leadership. When I enjoyed HR the best was when I fully embraced it as a staff function. I was not the surrogate, butt whipper. I was not the principal's office. I wasn't the corporate cheerleader. I might have been custodian of a message. I might have been the steward of the talent across the organization. What I find, what HR does best is to be the voice of the workplace, particularly around the intangibles. The voice that says compliance is not what's most important. Impact is what is most important. I think it's imperative for someone in that role to have the courage to stand up. I worked in a very large global organization. If it was publicly traded, it would have been in the Fortune Global 10. And they had a chief ombudsman that existed outside of HR. And when I first entered that organization, I had a lot of difficulty figuring out what that person's role was. I mean, it sounded like a 1-800 employee complaint on steroids. What I realized, what the intent, I won't talk about the efficacy of that role. I will say the intent of that role was to provide a source for feedback that would go back up to the board level about what's the pulse, what's going on in the organization, how are we walking the talk, and we are a geographically incredibly dispersed organization. How are we behaving our values in all of the places that we serve the communities we're in? So what's the role of HR? I think it's to bring information as to what's really going on the ground. I think the hardest part of it, it's very easy to accept the ownership. I can remember interviewing for a senior role with a CEO who basically said, so what will it take to help you be successful here? And the response was, I've got an incredibly complex business to run. If you could just take care of these people problems, I will never ask you of another thing. I mean, that pretty much wrapped up our conversation, because leadership is a leadership accountability, not a staff function. So what can HR do? It can support voices for change. But again, it has to go back. The function needs, I'll apply my same test. Does the HR function know itself? Does the HR function know its people? Does the HR function know its craft? Does the HR function know whom they serve? If there is clarity around those four things, taking action will always be challenging, but it doesn't have to be difficult. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I've got maybe two things to add if you don't mind.
Please.
One of the simple lists, and I'm certain that the question is out there. What a leader pays attention to, measures, and controls tells people what's important. So what I'm looking at, what I measure in whatever type of system, and performance appraisal sits between the leader and the HR system. And then what I control tells folks what's important, and that starts setting some of the tone for culture. And then the second thing is kind of what's the ruler that I use, the criterion I use to select folks into the organization, to reward and compensate people, to promote them, to put them into positions of responsibility, or to excommunicate them from the organization. And those criteria also are values-based. And so those two things to me have to go hand in glove with the HR function. So the strategic HR part of the question was what we pay attention to, measure, control, and then the criteria we use to do all of the good and bad things with our our difficult things with our workforce. So I think if we think about that combined with what you've said, that gives us a really powerful answer to the question. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. If I could, while you were speaking, Mike, I wanted to do some quick backup and provide a little clarification. If anyone really did scribble on a napkin my little X and Y grid, I wanted to change the definition of the X and Y axis that might make things a little bit clearer. And I also wanted to give credit for the person who shared it with me. The Y axis was conformity, and the X axis was awareness. So in that upper left-hand corner, you had a high awareness and a high desire for conformity. The rhino we talked about had high awareness. Very high awareness is what the status quo was, but a very low interest in conformity. And so, and the author's name is Aga, A-G-A, Bager, B-A-G-E-R, and she's I believe in Copenhagen, Denmark. So sorry about that. What's the, pick a really hard one for us, and I'll let Mike go first. Adam, are you up?
I am. Okay, so this is a pretty broad question. So what are some actions that leaders can do to create and maintain the right culture?
Okay, I'm going to sound like a broken record. If you want to create and maintain the right culture for you, I really think it's going to go back to, do you know yourself? Do you know your people? Do you know your craft? Do you know whom you serve? Do you act on that knowledge? And then finally, I'm going to break down, do you act into three components? And again, some of this may sound familiar to folks who were in the last call I got to share on. What do you say? What are the words that come out? What are the messages that come out of your mouth? Not just the vocabulary you use, the tone of voice. What is it that you are communicating in your words? What is the behavior you're modeling? Again, one of the leadership 101, be prepared to be seen by everybody. There is no hidden gesture, a great example today. There's a very prominent member of Congress who was caught in a hot mic incident in the last 24 hours, begging for an opportunity to address a rally in a city that's experiencing a lot of this unrest. And what got picked up on the hot mic was, I wouldn't really be asking, but I have a tough primary coming up. Or I think his words were, if I didn't have a primary, I wouldn't care. Now, I don't know the context of that message, but I can tell you that one little soundbite is going to haunt that man. And this guy's been in Congress since I was old enough to vote. So what are your words? What are your deeds? Your words in action? And finally, and the absolute most important, what is it you are reinforcing? Not just the behavior you tolerate, what's the behavior you reinforce. Little aside, I spent 7 years living in downtown Minneapolis. The precinct that was taken over, I didn't live in that exact neighborhood, but it was a neighborhood I walked frequently. You know, I know that AutoZone store that burned. I know the Macy's and the Targets that are boarded up. Breaks my heart. There was a culture somewhere in that department that was acceptable behavior. Is it possible that if this was a one-time, is it possible this was a one-time incident of one individual who made the best decision he knew how to make with the information he had on hand and thought it was the right decision to do, or was there malicious intent? I do not know. I mean, I was not there. I will tell you that there is a pattern emerging that reflects, at least in part, this was not the behavior of an alien from outer space beamed into a situation around which they had no context or understanding. So what happens when you have a culture that's dominated by sheep? Again, I don't mean that they're cowardly and unafraid to stand up. I'm just saying they're uncomfortable doing anything other than enabling the status quo. You know, again, I don't use any of those 4 categories as an insult or a pejorative. You know, it's just an element of our individual behavior in a cultural context, you know. And to what degree did that culture cause that horrific incident to happen? No, I don't think it would be foolish to say it was a root cause. Was it an influence at some level? I think it's impossible to deny that it was. So again, go back to know yourself, know your people, know your craft, know who you serve, know what to do next, and then what do you say, what do you do, and what do you reinforce?
Brian, I think that's a really important message in there is that I don't think we ever have truly homogeneous culture. You know, when we talk about an organization's culture, some organizations are schizophrenic. There are going to be some microcultures in pockets of that organization that may be completely in violation of what the greater picture of what it means to be us is. We as leaders, you know, Drucker was attributed with saying it. He never did, but it certainly sounds like something he would have said. You know, that leaders or that culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch, choose your meal, but that it's a trump card and it overplays strategy. That culture will eat strategy. And so I think it means we also have to think about the fact that we've got to align our cultures as well. So if we're trying to align our compensation systems with outcomes, if we're trying to align our LTIP, STIPs with strategic goals, we should be aligning our culture as well with what we want to achieve and who we want to be. A few years ago, the Australian Army caught a group of its officers and non-commissioned officers sharing pornography and making horrific statements about women service members. And if you ever get the chance, go look for it on YouTube. The Chief of Staff of the Australian Army looked the camera in the eye and he says, if this is you, get out. It was the clearest definition of a cultural statement that I've ever heard. So, you know, we have to realize that those microcultures may be running counter to what we're doing. And we have to root out those pockets.
You know, it's funny. I'm going to go back to, you know, kind of the number one, that is correct. And I would say the culture that is the culture that any individual is often going to be most closely associated with or impacted by is the microculture that they're in. You know, could be your office in a big organization. It could be your department. It could be your line of professional community, your geography. I mean, those, you know, the tribal, what are the things that we do? How do we act? What do we say? How do we behave? How do we dress? You know, among those closest to us is really where a lot of that identity is coming from. And that is often more of an influence than a greater culture. Mm-hmm. You know, the other, I lost my train of thought here, Mike, forgive me. The other kind of goes back to, it's really about identity. And when we were talking about LTIPs and STIPs, incentives and rewards, you know, again, I was advising a law firm recently, and they were talking about their partner profit sharing. And I said, you realize when you talk about, you talk about your values and what you're for as a firm. I said, do you realize the single most tangible, measurable indicator of what this firm believes is a given partner's value to the firm is in a check that you give every February? That's it. I'm not saying it's the only thing you do to reflect value and contribution, but it is the single most tangible thing you do that shows people really how do you feel.
Mhm.
So you can talk about, oh, we value so-and-so who reduced their schedule to stay home more with their family. The tangible output of that value is the size of that check. What are you reinforcing? And to your point about it's all this left brain stuff about strategy and KPIs and objectives and great, but culture doesn't pull you from the prefrontal cortex. Culture values pull you from your heart. But because that kind of pull is stronger to measure, we don't talk about it in organizations. But make no mistake, who you are trumps what you do 100% of the time.
Mhm. I've just got a text that I think we have one more question. Is that right, Erica and Adam?
Actually, Mike, we have two.
Okay, we're running to time, so let's go ahead and do those.
Okay, so I'm gonna go with my question for you, Brian. How do we develop accountability in our folks or even in the leaders that are above us?
Great question.
I'm glad that went to you.
So number one, again, it's going to sound like a cop-out. Know yourself, know your people, know your craft, know whom you serve, and don't be afraid to authentically talk about that with your team. If that gets incorporated in your priorities, you can have a very emotionally neutral conversation about someone not owning the unintended consequences of their behavior, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And I also think, I asked earlier, what's the emotion that tends to generate just when you hear the word accountability? For most folks, it's a tightening in the gut, because accountability is what they're dying for to see from their people, but leaders chap when they feel like they're being held accountable. They feel like it's being micromanaged. For me, I think it's in knowing what's the important stuff, having a candid conversation, when things aren't going, when you're not seeing the result that you expected to see. And again, I come back to every frustration in the workplace is simply an unmet expectation. So leader, look in the mirror first. Were you clear on what your expectation was? And did you have an opportunity to level set that expectation before the task was given to the individual? If you did that, some of the burden has shifted from you. If you hadn't, own the whole burden. Second, when it doesn't matter, engage in a dialogue and don't be punitive. Try to go into, be curious. What was behind that person not being able to meet what you understood to be a very clearly communicated expectation? And again, it should take a lot of the negative energy out of the conversation if you keep it on those behavioral terms. Managing up is a little bit more complicated. I think the key driver in those situations is trust. And trust gets a lot of talk, but how do I say it? A lot of talk publicly in teams, but the real juicy conversations about trust really happen in conversations of 2 and 3 among subgroups within a team. I mean, I'll talk about a trust model at another time, but I'm doing it this way. How do you do it? Is what's the way you can never guarantee that the feedback you want to deliver is either wanted or going to be acted upon. So I would simply offer this. If you're going to offer some feedback that your boss looks like they're not being accountable, I mean, I would, number one, make sure your facts are, I'm being very practical here. Have your facts straight. Understand what you know is fact and what you believe because of assumption. And understand that clearly, and when you go to give feedback, articulate both very clearly, because chances are you don't know 100% of the situation. Number 2, don't barge in like a hero. Find the right moment to say, to approach this leader and say, I'd like to have a conversation with you, and I'd like to share some observations that may be uncomfortable, but that I offer for the good of us. Would you be willing to make some time for that conversation? If the answer is yes, go in, but make sure you have those 2 columns of information. If the answer is no, say, is it a matter of it not being the right time, or is it just not the right conversation? If it's not the right time, come back later for the right time. If it's not a conversation for which they've expressed interest, you will not be a hero by setting yourself up as a martyr, probably because someone else came to you and you've convinced yourself that because you're a subordinate leader, you have to go in and be someone's white knight and rescue the situation. There is a formula for speaking truth to power. And one of the elements of that formula, quite frankly, by those who live to tell the tale, is to know when not to. And that's just a harsh reality. If I haven't said anything provocative up to this point, I bet I did just there. And if anyone wants to continue the conversation another way, another time online, I would be thrilled to do that.
Thanks, Brian. We got one more question here. So as we are managing on-site and off-site staff, the models of the branch office versus corporate office is out the window. Managing corporate staff tend to be more sheep and tend to need more collaboration. What would your recommendation be for promoting the best culture, as online meetings won't always meet the social needs of the corporate staff?
Oh, wow, that's a great question as well. So one of the things, I read a recent survey about one of the things that were causing stress as people were preparing to return to something that looks a little bit more familiar to what December of 19 looked like in terms of office arrangement. And it was this paradoxical, it's been great being at home and not having to deal with, Fred or the nonsense or the mess. And it's I can't wait to get back to the office because I can have my work life back again and create some space for my home life. So I'm going to talk to 2 things. Number one, for those that are remaining in that virtual world, the opportunity to foster connectivity is more difficult. There are things we miss, even with Zoom, and I know we're doing a lot of Zoom bashing, but I'll tell you what, it's still a whole lot better than the telephone. And that's still a whole lot better than email, and it's a whole lot better than when we used to have to write correspondence. What I think is imperative for leaders, again, and people are going to think this is the only thing I ever talk about, and I promise you, this little bit about no way is not more than an hour old. But I think it comes back to know yourself, know your people, and that means even as peers in a virtual team, take a moment for the social stuff. Don't let every interaction, particularly if you're the leader, don't let every interaction be about solving a problem. Don't let every interaction with members of your team be about them providing you with information or solutions. Take the time to figure out what's going on with them, because the opportunity to feel disconnected is greater than it's ever been. And really, what do you want as you're doing well as a leader when you sense your team is engaged. Being engagement looks a little differently now. I don't think we can completely replace in-person with virtual, but I think we can approximate it pretty well. And what you miss is the casual drop-bys and check-ins, and maybe every Tuesday, 15 minutes at 10 o'clock is not the right way to check in with all your people. And some people are going to be more interested in FaceTime and some people less, but a genuine approach that says, I care, I'm here, I want to know what's going on in your life to the extent you want to share and to the extent it's going to impact your performance. And there may be some unique obstacles you're facing that I may be in a position to help you remove. Have those conversations, create that lifeline for connectivity, and encourage that among your people.
I think there's a nuance in that question as well, Brian, of the difference between corporate and branch. Where's the work getting done? Where's the work being planned and centralized managed? And I think if there's a fault line of trust in an organization, there's going to be a demand for much more contact time, particularly in a virtual, because I've got to connect with those. I've heard of companies that are actually monitoring the amount of time that employees are spending online, through the company computers.
Mhm.
It's a metric, and it demonstrates the wrong culture as we were just talking about. And as leaders, we also have to be sensitive. I think if we're at the higher level of the organization, yeah, we want to know what's going on. We want to reach out, and maybe out of great intention, we want to show support. We also have to realize that when we have them do a meeting with us online, we're taking away from the time they have available to do the work that we've asked them to do.
Excuse me. Folks, I'm going to apologize. I have a little bit of a household issue, and I think my personal assistant, Mr. Gibson, may be trying to channel our conversation. I think that's
He
going to
does.
go.
He doesn't like my answer, Brian. That's okay.
No, it's
Well, we are at
a lot to unpack.
we're at time right now, Ania. But let me give you just one more second, or two. What would your final takeaways be? So the folks that are listening are leaders. They're interested in leadership development. And what would your final takeaway about culture to those folks be? I mean, you don't have to repack the full hour, but just what would you tell a leader that meets you in the elevator, and he says, "Hey, I heard you did an hour of culture. What do I need to know?"
I would say if you want to impact who your organization shows up as, it is as simple as knowing yourself, knowing your people, knowing your craft, and knowing who you serve. Okay. At the end of the day, if you have clarity, then you will be able to translate action into the appropriate steps.
Okay.
But we're so busy in the doing, we rarely take the time to they're easy questions to ask. If you've got an answer off the top of your head for each of those, you're probably wrong on 30% of it. That discovery requires some reflection. And most leaders are so busy running and gunning, they don't take much time for reflection.
Yeah.
That would,
even in the most calm of times, they don't take enough time for reflection. And right now, I think that we feel that we're losing precious time if we're not just doing. So fabulous takeaway. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I have to tell you that I am thoroughly impressed that you've got your dog on the timer. So it's like having your assistant send you a text to cut off a meeting. So, wow.
Again, my sincere apologies. I'm really embarrassed, and I actually did. There's a reason why I had no other alternative. And
That's
it's
okay.
a funny one.
Hey,
But
Brian,
I'm going to sign up. Thank you all so very, very much for having your time. If anyone has any additional questions, please send them to Erica. Anyone who didn't get heard from, if they had a question, I will make sure that Michael and I circle back and we get you an answer.
Thanks, Brian.